Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Voices for Tibet. On this new video series, we are trying to capture the voices of ordinary Americans supporting Tibetans, Tibetan culture, even Tibetan education in exile. For today, I'm really excited to introduce my friend Jennifer Prugh. I've known Jennifer Prugh for over 10 years. She's just this amazing person who's helped TCF in multiple ways. She's been a champion supporter of TCF, and from my perspective, everything that she touches has actually turned to gold, whether it's a sponsorship campaign or doing a project or anything else, being a super board member. So Jennifer Prugh, thank you so much. Welcome to the program, and thank you for being with us today.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, Carmen. I really appreciate the fact that you invited me. Thank you.
And Jennifer, so I begin these Voices for Tibet interviews by requesting my guests to tell a little bit about themselves, introduce themselves to the audiences so that the people listening to these Voices for Tibet get a sense of who they are, who is that person talking to them. So can you first introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, I co-founded and own a yoga studio in Silicon Valley, and that studio the intention is to provide yoga for everyone. We have a tea house and a wellness center, and we incorporate the Indian tradition, but also the Tibetan and Nepalese body-mind practices as much as we can. Um, and I run a Joy of Yoga teacher training at the 200 and 500 hour levels. And I'm about to introduce a 1,000-hour program. So I've been doing that for a long time, since I think 2006. And I was an artist for a long time and an associate professor. So when I approach whatever I approach, I love to write, and I love to make art, and I love to photograph, and I travel. I lead groups to different countries around the world. So all of those things combined, I do those.
Yes, and I understand. I was privileged to do a trip to Ladakh with you, and that was just, fantastic. So, Jennifer, there's just so many things I want to talk with you, but right at the top of my mind, I know this wonderful book, Rivers of Offerings, is coming up. And so, before anything else, I just can't hold it. I'm going to talk about Rivers of Offering, or rather, I'm going to let you talk
Here
about.
it is.
There you go. So, I mean, it's fascinating that you would write this book about the Ganges and how this ancient river can help us lead more meaningful lives, how it can mesh into the contemporary yoga world that you're so intimately connected to. But give us a sense of, aside from the Ganges, what other Tibetan Buddhist content is there? Tell us something about River
Yeah.
Offerings.
Okay, so I started the project when our good friend, India Supra, and my first teacher, Sherry Baptiste, was running a trip to India. And I was a yoga student and wanted to have a nearly month-long internal adventure through various parts of India. And through that, I became really interested in Tibetan education, for one thing, because of my watching India and how she would just give all the time. And we saw so much poverty, and I became interested in, well, what would it take to, build a school? And I mentioned that to India, and she said, oh, I have organization for you when we get home. And so that began my interest formally in Tibetan education. But the book itself, once I took that trip with India, I went back, and I went back several times. And first I was a student, and then she and I ran trips together. And I noticed every time I would go to India, I'd end up somewhere along the Ganges River, the Ganga. And and the adventures that I had in the various places were all quite distinct, but eventually all of this led to going to Clementtown, which is where Kitsaling is, uh, the hostel where we have all the kids and sponsor. And so that world opened up to me. And that is in the book, because the book is essentially a series of adventures, 12 different trips to the Ganges River over a 10-year period. And what's so great about the Ganges, when I realized that this book was about the Ganges, was when I went to the Kumbh Mela, which was this gathering of humanity, the largest gathering of humanity that takes place every 4 years. But this one in Prayag is particularly large. And there's not many Westerners there at all. And what I saw was, as a yoga practitioner, I've been so interested in trying to understand what the root of yoga is, as if there was one root. And what I saw when I went to the Kumbh Mela was that the tradition is built out of all of these different roots. And so many of those roots had come together at this river, and here the attention was on the river itself as this holy place.
Mhm.
And I realized that just shifted my whole way of thinking, because in the United States, while we do have national parks and people feel incredible reverence towards, say, Half Dome in Yosemite, it's a little bit different than having a spiritual relationship with a form of nature.
Right.
So from that experience, and that was in 2013, I believe, I decided to dedicate myself to seeing as much of that river as I could, from the top, the tip top, which is just at the border of Tibet,
Right.
of China, and all the way to where it empties out in the Bay of Bengal. And it's my adventures.
Right, right. But also in this journey also somehow took you to Dharamsala. I remember you met our wonderful Prime Minister, or Sikyong as we call it, Dr. Lobsang Sangye. What was that like?
Well, that was great. That was early on. I wanted to go to Dharamsala so much because I've been in awe of the Dalai Lama since I learned about him, and through you, I met Prime Minister Sangye, and when I met him, we had a meal together, and he said, well, I'll give you it's in the book, but the essential, I learned so much from about 30 seconds of conversation with him. I had one of those awkward moments where he had talked about Tibetan education, something we were both very passionate about. And then I asked him in that awkward moment, do you like your job? And I want to say first that he was taking his lunch time to be with me, and he was in a conference with people from all over the world addressing, there had been a whole series of immolations in a short period of time where Tibetans were protesting the Chinese government by setting themselves on fire. And so he had taken this time to be with me. And in that moment, when I asked, do you like your job? Does that sound like an American question? It does, doesn't it?
It does.
And he paused. He paused, and then he said to me, it's not about whether I like my job. It's about my serving. And it was a beautiful moment. And I looked at my own relationship to the work that I do and the sense of service. And the book is called River of Offerings. And so the river itself is offering itself. It's the sacred river, but it's also one of the filthiest rivers in the world. It offers itself to millions and millions of people throughout that region. And then it slips into the sea. And it's such a beautiful metaphor, living metaphor for our lives, really, that we have this chance. We're given this body and we're given these circumstances and these innate talents, and we each are integral. We play such an important role, even though it could seem like we don't, such an important role in giving what we have, our talents and our gifts, and offering them back to humanity and to the greater good while we're here, because then we are too will slip into the sea.
True.
So anyway, that's what I learned from him in Dharamsala.
Awesome, Jennifer. I'm so glad I signed into your Kickstarter. I can't wait for my copy to be here. But I wanted to move on and talk about Tibet and TCF. Let's talk about your connection to TCF. I know you have just been an amazing supporter, board member from all these years. Let's recall, how did that happen? How did your connection to TCF happen?
Well, early on, after that first trip with India, Supra, I went back about my life, really changed. I felt, knew I would go back to India and the country India. And then I went down to UC Santa Barbara to see the Dalai Lama talk about compassion for several days.
Oh.
And during the lunch break, I took a call. There was a voicemail that came from this man named Karma Tensum. And I didn't know who he was, but he asked if he could come with a couple of monks to present, have a sand mandala made in San Jose, where I live, and would I be willing to consider hosting the event? And I had never done anything for nonprofit before, but here I was at the Dalai Lama's on compassion, and karma calls, and so of course I said yes, and that began. You came, yep. And the monks were so lovely, and we did the event at San Jose Museum of Art and in the lobby there, and it was so successful. And I think the part that so moved me was the humility. That in this culture, there has been so much drive to create almost like a Teflon personality of amazingness. And the Tibetans just don't do that. They're humble. My experience has been that even in the most dire situations, they stay true to their practice. They forgive. I mean, some of the atrocities that they've suffered are, they're unbelievable. And there's this kindness that pervades, and every single one of them I've met, it's been like this. So then eventually I went back to Clementtown, and in Clementtown, in this question, because so many of the first trips were about looking at my relationship to the yoga practice and what was really meaningful about the practice for myself. And I sat and watched an older nun, and she's in the book too, walk with a walker. She circumambulated the stupa, and essentially she's chanting a mantra and walking so slowly around the stupa. And every morning that I was there, she was up at 5. And if it took her an hour and a half to get around what would take everyone else maybe 10 minutes, she showed up. And not only that, she showed up with such kindness. She was so warm with everyone. And that shifted my understanding of the practice. If everyone practiced kindness, well, we would have a different world. True. And the Tibetans, why I consider them to be like true gems, is that they represent, in many respects, some of the qualities that are so critical for humanity to embrace. The greatest being, well, I'll give them 2, kindness and compassion.
Right. But Jennifer, I remember coming down to San Jose Art Museum with the Venerable Nawang Chögyod, Lama Peljo. We did that wonderful sand mandala presentation. And I believe at that time it was the most successful event TCEF had ever done. And so, just coming there, I knew that I had come across someone special. And I
Wow.
also wanted to thank you, just being on the Voices and talking about those qualities of Tibetans, because essentially this is what the Voices is about. We feel like after 60 years in exile, slowly the dramatic escape of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the occupation of Tibet, it's kind of fading away from global consciousness. And so my best hope is for people like Jennifer Prugh to say something about Tibet, so that it not only helps gather support, but it gives some kind of inspiration and hope for someone like Karma Tensum, like a Tibetan hanging on, thinking that something wonderful will happen to Tibet. And talking about Tibet, Jen, um, you know, I've been privileged to know many people, but not many of them have been to Tibet itself. I myself, I left Tibet when I was really a young child. So I have no real memories of Tibet. And I know you have been to Tibet, although it might have been a brief visit. Still, I'm really curious to know what your recollection, what your memory of Tibet, say like Lhasa, the streets of Lhasa, how did it feel for you, like a Tibetan activist, a supporter, when you went and visited Tibet? What was it like? Help me relive some of those moments.
Okay, well, I feel as though I need to include in compare and contrast Nepal,
Okay.
Tibet, and Ladakh. Oh, and I'd probably add Bhutan in there also. So all along the Himalayan region,
Mm-hmm.
it's so different depending on the government and how the government and some history of that space, but how the government is working. And Nepal is really in an interesting situation because it's between China and India, these two huge countries, and it's a sliver, but such an essential sliver right there on the mountain with a lot of, they've got a lot of infrastructure issues, really challenging. Bhutan is a little bit further east, and it is well run. It's run by a kingdom, and it's a good kingdom, and it's run so beautifully. And then Tibet has been, yes, taken by the Chinese government, and Ladakh, I think, is much like Tibet would be if it hadn't been taken by the Chinese government. Although it is very close to the military bases and it's got a military presence because of the protection, still the people are free, although it's cold and closed off for most of the year. I think that is the feel of what Tibet would be like. I had been warned about Tibet because the Chinese government had been there for a long time before I was fortunate enough to go. And and China is such, they're so efficient. They're so efficient. And so what has happened is it is the Chinese version of Lhasa. If you circumambulate, there are still places that the Tibetans can practice.
Mm-hmm.
And there are monasteries that maybe had originally been attacked, but then were refurbished.
Uh-huh.
It's very restrictive. Like we were in a bus, and in that bus, there was a Chinese police officer with us the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
So that when we went up to the Everest base camp on the Tibet side, and I took a tree pose because that's what yoga people do. They take a picture of themselves in a posture, and the Chinese military was not happy about that.
Oh, they didn't like that, did they?
No, not at all. But the feeling is, yes, you can practice in these areas. But when I got home and I edited the photos, I noticed when I zoomed in that there were police up on the top of the roofs. They were stationed up there as people are circumambulating. There's a constant watchful presence.
Right.
And I think that, this is my personal feeling that the people are happy enough. They've moved a lot of Chinese folks into the area, and they're happy enough by providing income and education and things, much like America.
Hmm.
Give Americans their things, and that's a shame. That's a shame.
Right, right, right. But Jennifer, in one of my previous conversations, and this is the sense I get from, talking to folks like you who have been to Tibet, is that materially there's some trickle down effect from the Chinese economic boom. Having said it, it seems like in Tibet they still don't have many of the freedoms that we take for granted here in the West. For example, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he is huge for all of us. For millions of people, he is a religious teacher. For a Tibetan like myself, he's a reincarnation of Avalokiteshvara. And I get the sense that Tibetans in Tibet, they get to live a fairly comfortable life, but at some level they've got to keep their eye levels low, not always sort of look behind their shoulder, be careful that they are not involved in any political activity. Did you sense or get a sense of this at all?
Yeah, I did. I joined the circumambulation, and as I was walking, I was with a friend. And when you're walking around the monastery, people are still talking with each other. And I was talking with my friend. Tibetans were talking with each other, and I laughed. And there was an older Tibetan woman who mimicked my laugh. She thought my laugh was funny, and she laughed really loudly. And then I turned to her, and she was a doll. She was just a lovely human being. And I laughed with her, and her daughter was with her, and her daughter quickly took her away from me,
Oh,
walked quicker, and then she turned around and she went like this, and then she pointed up to police that were above. And so that was very clear that there was some sort of understanding that there is this sense of you keep your head down, you do not attract attention, and that you are limited, that your movement is limited, your expression is limited.
I did that. See, that's the sense that I, sort of get from visitors visiting Tibet. But I wanted to move on and say that, you know, I'm now in my 60s. I don't know whether I'll ever be able to go back to future free Tibet or something. But something that a lot of Tibetans care passionately is for the Tibetan cultural identity. Even if we cannot have a country, we argue that let us at least keep our culture. And I know that here in the Tibetan Children's Education Foundation, we try our best to help preserve Tibetan culture. And so one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, and through you sort of get a support from a lot of Americans, is how can ordinary Americans support Tibet, even if they cannot directly support and affect the lives of Tibetans in Tibet? How can people help to keep at least the culture and the spiritual heritage of Tibet alive? What are some things that ordinary Americans can do to keep the culture of Tibet alive?
Well, that's a good question. Um, I mean, I can only speak for myself. I think there are a lot of yoga practitioners. There's millions of them, and many of the most rich teachings, at least from my perspective, come from Tibet. So, from a yoga practitioner's standpoint, actually in the Yoga Sutras, there's four Brahma Viharas, which are known as the four immeasurables in Buddhism. And those four immeasurables are boundless joy, uh, which essentially means appreciating the joys that other people have, loving kindness, compassion, and equanimity. And so learning about Tibetan Buddhist way of life and philosophy, some of those principles can be, through practice, incorporated into one's daily life to I mean, that in of itself is incredibly valuable. Finding Tibetan organization, well, like TCF, because obviously
Right.
we love TCF, that helps to support Tibetan children's education so that Tibetan children who don't live in Tibet continue to have access to their own culture, and then celebrating some of the incredible arts that come out of Tibet. And what's so incredible about Tibet, like nowhere else in the world, in my mind, is the way in which the artistic expression has so much meaning built in it. Learning about that meaning, we may think, oh, it has nothing to do with my life. It has everything to do because we're human beings. And the way in which they express these basic truths about what it means to be a human being, and that those basic truths can be incorporated into one's own life despite what culture you come from. That's exciting. Not to mention the fact that some of these cultures with this great stream of wisdom, they share some of the most basic principles that are so essential to being happy human beings.
That is beautiful.
So yeah, become interested and find an organization that really moves you. We happen to know one.
Right. Jen, that was such a profound thought. I really appreciated that insight. And, I'm going to take advantage of having you in front of me to ask something about TCF. I don't want us to get ahead of ourselves, but let's say 5 years from now, in projecting forward, what are some of the things that you would really like this organization to focus on? We work for children's education or preserving culture or even trying to take care of the elders. Those are some of our core projects. But you, as this intelligent businesswoman out of Los Gatos in California, with that thinking cap on, what would you love TCF to achieve in the next 5 years moving forward?
Well, I need to give that some considerable thought, for real. But I think that there are two projects that we have been working on some. And one of them is to enable all the children in Clementown to have some sort of a tablet. And now with COVID, you can see that this laptop business, this computer business, and the fact that this is how we are able to communicate has become utterly essential. And that the people who get to share and build culture are the ones with the tools. So I would like to see all of our Tibetan children have access to a tablet, so that when they do a tablet or a computer, so that when they do go out into the culture, they can play that way. I think I look at, even in my area, the kids who do not have computers, it's a travesty right now. So there's that. And the other is that the Tibetan cultural artifacts, I think, to have a place where you could go and learn anything you wanted about Tibetan culture online, I think that would be really valuable. We have no idea right now what is happening with our world. We are becoming this global culture where boundaries are melting. And yet, one of the great gifts of the Chinese occupation, inadvertently, one of the great gifts was that Tibetan Buddhism, the streams they've touched my life, they've touched our lives in a way they likely might never have, because it's traveled to other places. So I want, if I had a wish, it would be, especially around the compassion and kindness and some of those basic tenets. And they're more than good ideas. There's a way to work with oneself where they're lived, felt realities. How the heck to make a place where people could come and learn about, if you had a mother who taught you these things,
Yes.
Amazing. But many people don't.
Right.
There's so much beauty built into the tradition, and if it could somehow be easily articulated in a hub,
Right.
for people to, that would probably be my wish. And I have one other wish, if we're asking about wishes, and that is I really would love to be involved in supporting a school in Ladakh, because Ladakh is one of the last vestiges of Tibetan culture. And there's so much, most people will never go to Ladakh in their lifetime,
Right.
right?
Right.
But how these different voices, and I love the idea that you're doing these interviews too, but voices of Tibetans and how they've integrated their practice and their heritage into modern life, I think is also really valuable question.
Right. 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 So there you go, Jennifer. Looks like we have a work cut out to build that school in Ladakh.
Okay.
And then, talking about those values, when I was listening to you trying to learn compassion, it seems like you were more or less centered around the thought of His Holiness the Dalai Lama when he talks about educating the heart also. When we,
Yeah.
train our mind, at the same time, he talks about educating the heart. So I sense that that was one of the critical pieces that you have your sight set on. And, Jennifer, I just want to say that for myself, Karma Tenzin, I feel so privileged to have known you. Thank you so much for being this fantastic voice for Tibet. My hope is this, that many other people will listen to your voice, listen to my voice. Hopefully, it will snowball, and we can get so many more people supporting Tibet, because I know as a Tibetan that we are going through a history, perhaps the darkest period of our history, and if Tibet ever needs help, it is now. So thank
Yeah.
you so much for
Yeah.
amazing support and for being a voice for Tibet today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again.